Hi, this is Ryan Evans of War on the Rocks, but this is not an episode of War on the Rocks. This is actually an episode of the Russia Contingency, which is one of our members-only podcasts. And this is, of course, hosted by Michael Kofman. It's the first of a two-part conversation with Rob Lee on the role of drones in the war between Russia and Ukraine. If you want to listen to the second part and more of these fascinating conversations, whether it's on the Russia-Ukraine war or our many other members-only podcasts, become a member at warontherocks.com/membership. Enjoy the show.
Okay, welcome back everyone to another episode of the Russia Contingency. Today with me I have my good colleague and friend Rob Lee. We're going to do a follow-up episode to the previous one that we recorded with some of our insights from a recent field study to Ukraine. This one's going to be dedicated to drones and various types of uncrewed weapon systems. We are going to dig in primarily into the ones used by various types of ground troops. So I don't think we're going to cover too much in the maritime space, but focus primarily on various types of tactical drones and strike drones. But we'll see what we end up doing. If you're into drones and if you like uncrewed systems and you're curious about their evolution, their trajectory in this war, this is going to be the episode for you. Okay, and if you're not, I hope it's still going to be pretty interesting. And we'll cover how drones evolved in the war. We'll cover the role of big Western tech giants. No, I'm just kidding, because they haven't had much of a role, despite all the PR I keep reading online about what big players they are in this war, which I don't necessarily think is true. But we won't go down that rabbit hole. We'll talk about innovations and development of these systems. Rob, let's start off with very briefly catching folks up to today, right? The beginning, early period of the war. Right? How did drones start off on the battlefield? Maybe you tell your side of the story. I'll tell my side of the story of what I remember, what I saw, and we'll get folks caught up to 2024. Then we'll talk about where drones are. We've done a lot of work with different types of drone units, particularly on this most recent trip, and where we think the technology is going.
You know, one thing to keep in mind with drones, as with many things in this war, is that many of the dynamics that occurred at the beginning of this war were affected by Russia's invasion in 2014. Right, so it's not as though the war began now. A lot of the developments in UAVs and other things were things that were developed since 2014 that prepared Ukraine for this war this time. And so, you know, one example, when Russia invaded in February 2022, Ukraine had a number of the R-18 big kind of modified agricultural UAVs they used to drop mortar rounds and a variety of other things. Those things have been developed in the previous years before the war began. And that was something that capability Ukraine had right at the beginning of the war. They would not have had otherwise, because there was this process of development of UAVs in combat even before this, because obviously, you know, there was fighting going on with a somewhat fixed front line for numerous years before 2022. So I think, in short summary, when Russia invaded, one thing we learned is that Russia did not have enough UAVs in their service, right? So Putin had mentioned that they had a large part of the GPV 2020, the State Armaments Program. UAVs were a big priority because they didn't have enough in 2008 with the Russia-Georgia War. That was a key kind of finding they had. And yet in this war, many Russian brigades, they didn't have enough Orlan UAVs. They didn't have other UAVs. And they actually found that was a key weakness early on. And I think they're much slower to adapt to that necessity than Ukraine was. So one of the things we learned early on is that much of the experimentation with UAVs was really a bottom-up process. It wasn't necessarily coming from the military itself, from higher ups. It was individuals at the low levels kind of developing this. Some people had a background in UAVs. In the Battle of Kyiv, one thing we found out was that there was a large group chat on WhatsApp of Ukrainians who lived in Kyiv who owns UAVs and commercial UAVs, and they just started texting each other, and they started locating targets for themselves and then passing those targets over WhatsApp to Ukrainian artillery crews, right? And that's the kind of bizarre nature of the fight in Kyiv and elsewhere, was that a lot of this was very improvisational.
We should say that what you're talking about is an episode of that famous Bravara ambush video, right, of the Russian tank regiment that stacks itself on the road, and it's very early footage from the war, for those of you who remember it, and it just starts getting rocked by artillery, and the whole thing is an interaction between somebody who has a drone up and has a feed, and guys on the ground that see there's this feed and connect to them via WhatsApp and basically say, hey, can we hop in on this with you? And but I always said you check this anecdote because you love it when a plan comes together, and that's one of those cases early on. It was far more ad hoc and just troops connecting with drone operators at the beginning.
I think we were told, and I have to go back and look at the notes from this. I think it was like 80 people in Kyiv who had their own UAVs that connected early in the war, and they started sharing information, like on WhatsApp. And literally in this case, as you said, I think it was a civilian who was, had a UAV up, was actually scanning for things, found, I think it was Russian 6th Tank Regiment, in Tipperary. He was the first to locate it, passed that information over WhatsApp. They got in touch with a artillery commander from the 72nd Brigade, and that's how that engagement happens, right? Again, just this kind of wild improvisational thing. And so basically in 2022, Ukraine was much better at adapting and improvising, especially at the low level, than Russia was, and UAVs is kind of one of the obvious ways they did this. And early on, it was mostly, I think, DJI Mavics were the kind of obvious UAV that was used very heavily. It was mostly using these kind of commercial UAVs to locate targets for artillery, to improve and facilitate artillery strikes. And then over time in 2022, they started adapting Mavics to drop grenades. Mavics are pretty small UAVs, so they can't really carry much in the way of munitions, but maybe, one or two like hand grenades, like an F1 hand grenade, or 40 millimeter Mark 19 grenades, you could drop like 2 at a time. And so I started using those. That became quite useful, especially when, say, a tank might be immobilized. This kind of UAV could go out, and instead of sending out, personnel into no man's land to destroy a tank, you could send a Mavic out instead, and you're not putting someone at risk, right? So that was kind of that development in 2022. And then by the end of 2022, Ukraine started using FPVs more prevalently. I think we saw it over the summer, but really towards the end of 2022 and over the winter of 2022, 2023, and FPVs started to take on this kind of bigger role. And at the same time, basically throughout this war, Russia has largely kind of been behind on Ukraine on developing on UAVs, but they'd copy those advances. And so as 2022 wore on, Russia started using Mavics as well. They started procuring commercial UAVs to make up for the lack of military UAVs in service. And then the same thing happened to FPVs in 2023. And I think when in January 2023, the Ukrainian General Staff made a decision where they were going to set up strike drone companies in every brigade. I think it was made in January, like 27th or 23rd, around that time frame. And basically, it was acknowledgement that up until then, right, most of the UAV development had been ad hoc, improvisational things. In many cases, the most successful early UAV commanders were guys who were maybe entrepreneurs before the war, maybe they were politicians, they had some kind of public profile, they were able to fundraise better, they were able to kind of put the units together. They obviously saw a need that there was something they can improve upon in terms of fire support. They weren't getting sufficiently maybe from artillery or something else, and UAVs were a way to kind of provide an additional advantage. And basically, the story I think in 2023 is that the General Staff started to recognize this was an important development, recognize that there was untapped potential. They could if they applied kind of more doctrine, more structure, training, kind of more government support from this. And over the span of 2023, we started seeing Ukraine stand up a bunch of strike drone companies in most brigades. They report right to the brigade commander. It was kind of a new form of fire support for the brigade commander. But all of this was very experimentational. Most of these units, right, they tried to set up a kind of table organization, table equipment for these units, but every few months we see adaptations to technology, and so there isn't really one, I think, set standard right now for training, for personnel, for other things. It really depends on the situation, depends on a variety of things. And I'd say just the close of 2023. By the summer of 2023, Russia started copying the development FPVs. So we saw in the Ukrainian counteroffensive, Russia used FPVs quite heavily in Arihiv and other parts of the front line. By the end of the summer, it was pretty clear that Russia had a quantitative advantage in FPVs. So not only did they copy it, but they were able to basically scale production more successfully than Ukraine was. And keep in mind, throughout most of 2022, 2023, FPVs are mostly produced by people in kind of apartments, right? Individuals putting together maybe 4 or 5 a day. It wasn't really a scaled thing for most of 2023. I think it is now, but that's how we kind of got to this point. And so Russia scale production, they were using quite effectively. And by the end of the summer, we kind of reached a point where FPVs were playing an increasingly important role, denying mobility on both sides, making it very difficult to use vehicles, use armor at the front line, but even just getting to the front line, right? Behind the front line, getting infantry up to replace people, that was becoming more and more difficult. You could only do it at certain times when FPVs weren't effective. And so FPVs became increasingly important up until this winter period. And now I think we're in a new phase where advancement and quality are having a significant effect because the quantitative numbers are there on both sides, and now quality is becoming a bigger deal. Countermeasures have become a bigger problem for both sides, and so we're in a new kind of phase of the adaptation game of looking at where FPVs will go from here.
Sure, and let's talk a bit about categories. So the FPVs, what we typically discuss are commercially available drones made by a Chinese company, DJI, like Mavic or Matrix, but often used for reconnaissance, but sometimes used as light bombers. Heavy multi-rotor drones like R-18s, Vampirs, what have you, heavy shot that are used for as a much heavier bombing platform, essentially. And then we have various types of first-person view strike drones. And then we have various types of wing drones that can be used for ISR. Some of the larger ones on the Ukrainian side, like Shark and Leleka. On the Russian side, like Orlan 10 or Orlan 30 or SuperCam, something of that nature, right? Drones that can have medium endurance and operate at higher altitude. So this is primarily the systems we're talking about. At the beginning, both sides very briefly did use traditional strike drones. Ukraine did use Bayraktar TB2s, and they lasted the first couple of weeks before most of them were shot down. And Russia did use the small numbers of Orions and other drones of that type that it had. It used a couple of them around Mariupol in particular, where they had localized air superiority, not much of a threat from air defense. But I would describe their role as fairly brief in this war and not all that consequential. Although on the Ukrainian side, for the first week or so, when it looked like Russia was having a lot of rules of engagement issues and coordination between its air power and ground force air defense, they did play a very important role in those first couple early battles. I would say particularly the first couple of days. But so we're gonna leave that discussion aside because we're not here to talk about traditional strike drones of that type because they haven't had much of a role in this war. But we'll focus on these categories. And we'll discuss kind of, Rob, you did a good job going through the evolution. I just wanted to add that two things that folks should appreciate. One, obviously, drones have evolved with the various digital means of communications available on the front line, from Starlink terminals to various types of apps that were developed that enable information sharing. But, modern command posts today, if you're in there, what you'll typically see is a web-based application like Veja or Ochi that everybody sits in and watches drone feeds and can mic into the conversation during the video feed or record it. And then you'll have another screen up with Krupiva, the navigation artillery app for orientation. You might have another screen up with Delta, which integrates a lot of information from different data sources. And then, the rest of it, get ready to be blown away by the amazing proprietary technology. It's usually a bunch of folks on the Discord server, maybe a couple Google meetings up on a private brigade-sized server, and other people sitting on Signal passing information to each other or coordinates or what have you for artillery fire. But this is the bulk of it, and maybe a Motorola 128-bit radio or something of that type, right, for direct comms with some forward unit. Does that sound right to you, Rob, from your memory? Because this is what I typically remember as like the general setup that you might see in either a drone CP or an artillery battalion CP or a battery or something like that size. Yeah,
I think I forget if you mentioned more, but Krupiva is always up. Delta, you said Veja. I mean, it's basically in Ukrainian command posts. They have very good, I think, situational awareness of the battlefield. Because anytime, right, there are really only a few kind of key parts of the front line that are actually active at any one time, right? Because most of the front line is not where there's not much fighting going on, and so it'll be concentrated in certain parts. And there's certain areas, every unit there will have its own UAVs. they'll have a certain number of UAVs up at a time, and all the units there can see the feeds from those different units using Vasia, right? And so it's very useful in that, maybe the Rykov area or Bakhmut area, there'll be like 12, 20 UAVs up at a time. Some will be Mavics, right? Some will be these kind of long-range fixed-wing military-style UAVs for ISR purposes, and units can kind of share this information. And then if one goes down, another unit can kind of help out. But basically, they have very good persistent ISR of the battlefield. You can see tens of kilometers past the front line, and have a pretty good idea if the other side is trying to mass for an offensive, anything along those lines. It's much more difficult to do that and achieve surprise. And so I think that's the kind of nature of the battlefield. And of course now, Mavic 3Ts, they have thermal optics. So at nighttime, it's very difficult to kind of move without being spotted as well. And a lot of these, UAVs are not that expensive, right? So Mavics are a few $1,000. I think Mavic 3T is like $5,000. One of the big needs is the military style fixed wing UAVs that can operate, 10, 20, 30 kilometers past the front line. Those are a big need for artillery purposes, for finding targets, because keep in mind the Mavics and FPVs, Mavics don't operate much past the front line. Typically they can, but the range is not that great. FPVs can hit targets maybe 20, 25 kilometers at max for most FPVs.
That's very, very extreme range for an FPV. That's a FPV with a retransmitter drone rebroadcasting its signal. I think the most we hear is like 23, 25, but that's optimal conditions.
Right, optimal conditions. They are using fixed-wing FPVs now. So there's one other category we didn't mention, Mike. It kind of bleeds together, which is the kind of loitering munition category. Mm-hmm. Right. So in general, before the war, you had military-style UAVs and you had the kind of commercial-style UAVs. And the commercial ones are really the ones that have made the biggest impact on this war, right? The biggest development of what's happened in Ukraine, right? We saw the UCAVs before, and as you mentioned before, UCAVs, right? TB2 played a big role the first few days. That was mostly because Russia did not have proper coordination. Once they started actually trying to shoot them down, they shot them down in large numbers. They didn't have a huge role since then. The other style of military drone before that, aside from the ISR ones, the loitering munitions, Russia had Zala, they had Lancets, they had Kubs. They didn't have that many at the beginning of the war, but Lancets have become a quite significant factor. And those are military-style drones designed to destroy targets, also known as kamikaze drones. Lancets have been quite effective. They're pretty resistant to electronic warfare. They've got pretty good range. They've expanded the range to maybe 60, 70, maybe 80 kilometers at this point, maybe farther. They're adding kind of elements of proving kind of the targeting during the terminal approach. And they've also adjusted some of the munitions they use and also some of the kind of the targeting aspects to it. So Lancers are another big important aspect. There's a question of kind of where FPVs fill into this, because FPVs are still kind of commercial style drones. They weren't designed as military drones, but both sides are now developing fixed wing FPVs, some of which have a range of for 30, 40 kilometers. And so now we're getting into an area where, a long range FPV drone is kind of similar to these loitering munitions. And I guess it's kind of blurring the distinction between them. But I would say most FPVs, right, the ones that are commercial, they're really useful because they're quite cheap. So most of them are like $400 or $500, and then plus whatever the cost of the munition. Most munitions that both sides use for FPVs were either an RPG munition or maybe adapting some kind of grenade or other kind of improvised munition for them, right? Which the costs aren't that bad typically. The issue is that a lot of times FPVs, the range is not as great as people make it out to be. It's usually kind of less than 10 kilometers. You can get greater range if you use a retransmitter UAV to improve the signal. If you improve maybe the engine, the battery, you kind of get more expensive parts. That starts increasing the price, and then it gets to a question where where does it become? Where's the price point no longer as cost effective as it was before? Because a lot of these FPVs are no longer $400 anymore, especially when you add thermal cameras, other things onto them. You're talking about increasing the cost, and that changes kind of the cost benefit analysis here somewhat.
The big things that go into drones, right, on the payload side is the battery pack, right? The more batteries you put on, the more weight you add on the battery side. The second part is the payloads you mentioned. So most FPVs, for example, typically carry 1.3 to maybe 1.5 kg payload. That's fairly standard for them. And just to focus aside, now you can still pack a pretty good sized grenade or anti-tank munition in that, but it's not an artillery shell by any stretch of the word. And obviously, if you want to add payload, you're probably going to significantly reduce range. The other thing I want to say is that A lot of people see these systems as commercial, but it's important to convey that these are all modified systems. Early on in the war, when people used Mavics, guess what? DJI also made another system that we had seen used many times. Aeroscope, which was meant for police and security services. Both sides bought it. They deployed it at the front line. If you did not jailbreak your Mavic, right, which everybody does, if you did not essentially, let's say, crack the software in order to mask the data regarding your location and key information about the drone, somebody could be sitting on the front line with this device and a very basic software on any computer, any laptop, and could see all the drones around them, could see all the data information about those drones, all the Mavics and matrices up in the sky, and could see the point of launch and where they were being operated from. And that was an easy way to get killed early on. So I wanted to first convey that, yes, this is commercial technology, but its commercial technology has been modified. Then people started adding better antennas to the drones, right, to get more range, better signal. The GPS was useless on the drones since GPS is jammed everywhere on the front line. Nobody flies with GPS, like, on the line. You see the video footage of the drone, you got Crupiva app or something to orient yourself on the map, and you put those two and two together, right, typically. And then folks started making all sorts of modifications to them. Obviously, most of the components that these drones are built on are imported from China. The frames and other things could be easily 3D printed, right? And there's pluses and minuses to different types of frames. Some of the components of the bigger drones, yes, like Ukrainians may make more of their own. And same thing on the Russian side with the Orlans and the more military specialized drones. Those are much more self-made. But still, if you look at what's in them, you'll probably find that the light engines imported from somewhere else, since Russia never had basically, after collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia lost a lot of the better light aircraft engine industry. And you might find that the camera is a very standard commercial camera that's sort of in there. The reason I'm kind of telling the story is I didn't want to make it clear to people that these, on the one hand, these are commercial drones and they are built from commercial parts, but they are significantly modified at this point. And to basically convey that it's not just buying it and cracking out of the box and there you go, you're flying a drone. I mean, you can do that, but there are also very easy ways to get killed trying to do it that way. There's much more complexity that comes into this, and we're going to dive into that in a second. And let's talk a bit about kind of the composition of drone units, right? So a typical drone unit today, would have a pilot, right, for the drone. They'd have a co-pilot, right? Oftentimes they would have a technician to get the drone working, to get the system aligned, because there's plenty of times when things don't work. And they would have a munitions specialist, right? Somebody would actually fuse the munition, which is very dangerous work and very easy to blow yourself up doing it if you ever see what these things look like, especially with, the contact leads in front of it. And some of these frames, if the frame is metal conductive and you touch you touch one of these wires to it, you could easily kill yourself that way. Well, do you want to talk a bit about in general the sort of proliferation of drone units and their composition, just from a force structure perspective? What do these things tend to look like?
Sure. So the first point is it varies, right? There's no set example here. It's important to emphasize that, we talk about here, we may say things that another unit operates completely differently because it's these are new units. There's not a set doctrine, right? They are establishing that as we speak, right? They are determining this through experimentation. I think the Ukrainian General Staff recognize that this is best a bottom-up effort where development comes up from the bottom. They recognize that having individual units having horizontal communication with producers is a faster way of innovating than having this kind of vertically structured thing. So things are different here. So basically, every brigade, maneuver brigade, typically has a strike drone company. That company will typically have multiple platoons. Some of those platoons will have ISR drones, right? So some of them will have the military-style ISR drones that like FireEye, like Leica, Shark, those kind of UAVs that can do kind of, reach out to maybe 10, 20 kilometers past the front line, try and find operational targets, something important, ideally for, potentially for high Mars strikes, something long range. They'll have another platoon, probably with Mavics, so different kind of reconnaissance, ISR unit. And again, when we talk about the Mavic teams, these brigades will always have Mavics up in the air, right? There's always some kind of ISR asset up in the air at any time. And then they'll have a number of platoons of strike drones. These could be FPV platoons. They could be Mavic platoons with bombers, right? They're tasked with, performing a strike mission. And they could also have these night drones or, Baba Yaga or what have you, what they call with the R-18 or Vampire style, modified agricultural drones. They have maybe 6 or 8 arms. They can carry a lot more weight, right? And so instead of a Mavic that can drop like maybe 1 grenade, these drones can carry like multiple 82 millimeter mortar rounds. They can carry TM62 anti-tank mines. They can carry a lot of munitions, and they can drop a lot of things, and they can also drop a lot of RPG munitions at one time, which can do substantial damage on armor and other type of targets. And so that's what a normal strike drone company will look like. And then on top of that, battalions will have their own UAV platoon, right? They will also have Mavics, or Autels type commercial ISR UAVs. They will also have typically an FPV unit or a Mavic bomber unit, right? So a infantry battalion will have this organic, most cases. And then at the company platoon level, they also may have UAVs, right? And again, we're talking about guys will buy things on their own. They'll get crowdfunded things on their own. And so there isn't one kind of set structure. And in terms of the optimal structure, it's not clear what that is yet. Right, it's not clear what's going to be long term. It's in a kind of current process of development. But one thing I'd emphasize when we talk about UAVs and all these units, as Mike was saying, right, FPV team, typically 4 more guys. It could be less. It depends if they don't have enough individuals. And right now, the Ukrainian military is strapped on manpower, so that also affects their UAV units. But Strike Drone Company often has more than 100 personnel, right, and then. And in terms of UAV platoons and infantry battalions, we could be talking about 20 more personnel. And so we're not talking about small numbers here. That could be in a brigade, right? We could be talking about, 150 or 200 more personnel just operating UAVs. That is a significant manpower intensive element. And keep in mind too, for FPVs, just like anything else, you have to rotate guys off the front line. So the FPV platoon will probably have multiple FPV teams. They have to alternate because guys have to rest at times. And so, basically keep in mind, they have to have a 1-to-1 or 2-to-1, right, ratio of guy in the front line to everyone else, just kind of like infantry or anyone else. And so all of this comes back and saying it is a manpower intensive effort. It also requires a lot of equipment. There are a lot of other costs that go into it. So, you have to have guys who maintain the antennas, guys who just maintain the munitions. Finding munitions is difficult. So the Ukrainian government provides some of them. Other cases, they may have to find them on their own, right? That could be, using RPG munitions. It could be in some cases they will use, Smerch rockets with cluster munitions or DPSM. They'll use the sub-munitions from those things, right? And again, that's a dangerous process. And that a lot of times guys get wounded or somebody's even killed by kind of working with these things. So it is still very much an improvisational process. I would say on the Russian side, we don't have as much kind of information. I think they do have organic FPV teams in certain units. Also, in some cases, you have specialized units be the ones mostly using FPVs, right? So it could be Spetsnaz, it could be Akhmat units in some areas, right, where kind of the regular units are mostly focused on an infantry component, and then the UAV components will become different kind of units. I think, again, they're improvising things too. It's not fully clear exactly where they'll go, although I know of cases where some Russian military units will have FPV teams within infantry platoons, right? So I think all this kind of varies. And I think long term, it's going to, we'll see how exactly what develops, what the optimal structure is, optimal level of tasking at every level. One thing to keep in mind is that we talk about the brigade level. Typically, brigades only do a company assault at a time, right? So typically, we're not seeing multi-battalion assaults. So we're seeing maybe one company, maybe platoon at a time from the brigade doing assault. And that means even if the brigade strike drone company only has a certain number of FPV teams, they'll typically have enough teams to support that company assault. But a lot of times we talk about platoon or company assault, the ratio of guys operating UAVs to guys in the infantry doing the assault is often not as much of a difference you might expect, right? It could be 1-to-1 in some cases, could be 2-to-1, 3-to-1, so on of infantry to the actual UAV units that are supporting them. But the main point being the UAV operations is a manpower intensive effort, is not streamlined at this point. And particularly if you want FPVs to go long range, you need someone operating a retransmitter UAV, you need better antennas, you need other kind of things, all that increased costs. And also keep in mind for FPV teams, they typically use a vehicle to move around. So they're typically not right at the front. They'll drive up and they'll often move on foot for multiple kilometers to get to their location they launch from, because they don't want to get located either. And FPV teams are a high value target at this point, and so you need a number of guys to carry all the equipment, to maintain all the equipment. And again, when the pilots are flying, 2 pilots, all they're doing is flying. They also have to have someone operating a Mavic to locate targets for them. They may have to have another guy operating a retrans UAV just providing that signal, the line of sight. And they may need another guy operating munitions to adjust what munitions you want on the next FPV, depending on what kind of target it is, right? So if it's an armor target, personnel target, you want a different munition. So again, there are a lot of kind of details and dynamics that go into it that I think are more complex than people probably understand or realize.
Just taking a quick break from this free preview of the Russia contingency to tell you can get these episodes as much as you want if you become a member at warontherocks.com/membership. All right, interruption over. Back to Mike and Rob.
Yeah, let me add a couple points. So the team has to get out there at night because during the daytime, anything near the front line is covered by enemy drone teams. And you're often going to maybe drive to some point, but then you're going to have to hoof it with a lot of this gear and equipment too. This is just a fresh reminder. We've banged on this point before that, people think that in modern war, it's much more like a video game and fitness doesn't matter as much. Oh, but it will. When you're out there hauling the drones and the gear and the munitions, it will matter because in this war, when mobility is denied near the front line, including to the drone units, because look, if the drone, based on just topography alone, under good conditions, has 10 kilometers range, for you to get there, you have to be pretty close to the front line, right? So you're going to have to go up, if not directly to 0, but fairly close to the 0 mark in order to get some range and distance on your drone. And that means that those last couple kilometers, typically, in order to avoid being targeted, you're going to have to walk. A point on the drone team composition. So, if a typical assault group has 11 to 16 men, you can imagine that for 2 assault groups, so just kind of putting out one example, you would expect them to be supported by at least 2 Mavic teams, 3 FPV teams. Those teams might need some retransmitter units, operating transmitter drones, depending on the ranges they expect to be operating at. 1 to 2 heavy rotor units, multicopters, a wing drone team, and then, the front line itself is going to be covered by a number of teams whose job is to provide 24/7 ISR coverage, right, that are rotating. And so the drone support ratio, yes, could easily be double the assault group, if not more. And that's just all the people directly involved, not even counting, the folks doing C2, artillery, then the EW units, and then everybody else who might be, stationed in the front line with some part and role in it. So it does push personnel more into that support role. My impression on the Ukrainian side is you're saying that they want to drone companies, and then the desire is to have a drone platoon in every battalion. On the Russian side, well before the war, they'd expanded the force structure to accommodate having a drone company in every maneuver brigade, right? And then it looked like they were slowly expanding the drone component of the force and the EW component of the force as well. And then both sides kind of developed these specialized drone units that have names, and they brand themselves, and they go around the front, right? On the Russian side, maybe like Babior or Sudny Dень or something along those lines. On the Ukrainian side, some of them will talk about there are all sorts of specialized drone units or ones that are considered to be kind of elite, and they go to different parts of the front line and essentially work that part of the front line, and they often move to where the action is, right? One we spent some time with on this most recent trip was Magyar's unit over in Kherson, opposite the Krinky Lodgement. We'll talk about that a bit later as kind of a case. But one thing I want to emphasize is that you have to have experience with different types of drone units. You have to go to the poorest funded drone unit and the best funded drone unit and everything in between, because as Rob said, there isn't a standard force structure. Some drone units only have the drones provided by the government. Others have the funding and the access to get their own drones with their own components and build all their own stuff, right? And it might be higher quality, not might be, it will be higher quality, and they'll have their own EW systems or electronic recon systems that they build and allow their own equipment. and some will specialize in this, right? So they'll get folks from the civilian commercial sector to come work for them, and and others will be your typical drone company or drone platoon at a brigade, and they have what they have, and their force structure is prioritized to the extent that their brigade commander thinks that they're important relative to other people at the brigade that also are important and may need manpower, right? So it all varies unit by unit, and the fight is different in different parts of the front. Maybe one part of the front has a forest, and it's hard to use FPVs because you're going to lose signal, below 40 meters altitude once you get to the other side of the forest. So might be easier to use heavy multi-rotor drones there as an example. Another part of the front, the unit is situated in a way where they are operating the drones from relative heights and they have an open plane. So it's very lucrative terrain to use strike drones, right? Because you might have an advantage for signal propagation. And, you can see a lot and you can see it pretty easily. So that's more of more ideal conditions for strike drone employment. So it varies a lot, and that's why I'm a strong advocate of going to different parts of the front line to figure out how experiences vary, based on the geography and the way the fight's going there and the types and quality of units involved. Because otherwise it's kind of hard to get a sense of it. And you also, I think it's fair, Rob, you also get the impression that other drone units don't quite have the sense of it either. You're one part of the front line. You know what guys 500 kilometers away from you, what's going on in their part of the fight, and what are they facing. They might be facing the latest Russian technology, or you might be the one that's facing the latest Russian technology. You don't know which one of those two is necessarily true.
So I remember there's some people on Twitter asking me about this, about like what's the accuracy of FPVs. And I basically was like, we've heard such wide variance in the numbers from so many people, it's impossible to give you a good figure, right? Because basically the answer is it depends, and it's not a very satisfying answer, but that's the right answer, right?
Yeah, it's pretty contingent. That's what we should say, just to annoy people, because of the name of the podcast.
So when we take a step back and talk about the advantage, what the advantages of FPVs are and limitations, maybe that would be good to kind of structure. So we've already kind of dealt with this, but I think it's good to structure that way. The advantage of FPVs were, number one, they're cheap, right? So as I said before, a lot of them at the cheapest level are like $400, $500. Although, if you want them operating at the longer ranges, we talk about 20 kilometers or so, right? You need more expensive variants, especially as EW has gotten more capable, and other kind of issues have gotten more capable. You really have to invest more to get more higher quality FPVs. Same thing, FPVs can only carry a small amount of ammunition. So if the heavier FPVs can carry a bigger munition, right, is more likely to be able to kill a tank, something like that, whereas, so on. So number one is it's cheap. Two, FPVs are in many ways a response to a lack of artillery ammunition. I want to emphasize this one over and over again, because we consistently, when we talk to units, right, they say we are using FPVs because we do not have enough artillery ammunition. We would not be emphasizing them as much as we are if we had enough artillery ammunition, right? Now, the FPVs and artillery, I think, have a complementary role. FPVs can do things that artillery can't, and vice versa. But it's important to note that when we talk about why there's such a big emphasis on the Ukrainian side, it's because they do not have enough artillery ammunition. In particular, in some parts of the front, where they're with lower priority areas, FPVs become a higher priority because of the way of compensating. Munitions for FPVs early on were quite easy to come by because it was things they already have, like RPG munitions, like sub munitions from cluster munitions, from grenades. It was things that units at platoon or company level may have organic to themselves, and they say, okay, we're not getting enough fire support from the brigade for artillery and mortars. Okay, well, here's a way we can compensate on our level to get some kind of organic firepower. The nature of the front line is very fortified, right? We're not seeing much maneuver. It's very static. And under those conditions, longer range assets are even more important. So FPVs have a greater range than ATGMs. They have a greater range than mortars in most cases and other weapon systems. And so FPVs can kill targets at a longer range than other things that are available. And in particular, in some parts of the front, FPVs are sometimes the best counter battery option the Ukrainian military has, right? And so in some cases, they will really invest in it. They'll have retrans UAVs or other things to make sure FPVs can hit targets at 15, 20 kilometers. So you might hit artillery, and it become important for those reasons. So those are a couple of the advantages to FPVs. And of course, the commercial, right? So you can buy the materials through, different kind of Chinese sites or other places online. You can get a number of FPVs yourself because it's not just a military thing. And those are kind of some of the various ways. FPVs are also very accurate if you're piloted correctly. And so you can fly them directly into little dugouts and trenches, right? It makes them very effective in that case, which indirect fire is not always possible doing. You can maneuver over things, right? So you can maneuver over terrain. ATGMs can't do that, but you can get some kind of non-line of sight, indirect type of capability through FPVs, which is quite useful. So you get a variety of things as quite useful, and they're a very useful complement to other existing weapon platforms like mortars, artillery, armor, so on and so forth, right? So those are some of the advantages. Do you want to jump in before we get into limitations, or? I
mean, I like how you kind of covered the waterfront here. I think to me, the other things I would add is that, the relative ease of replacement, because a lot of this commercial technology that's commercially based, and you can import either the parts or the drones. And the relative ease of use, meaning it does require training. And I want to emphasize something. From what I've seen, much depends on the pilot's skill. Quite a bit depends on the pilot's skill in drone deployment. There's a huge difference between drone units who specialize in employing drones and maneuver brigades that have guys that are operating just drones in support in terms of performance, numbers of drones they lose on a monthly basis, and everything that goes into how you might assess effectiveness. So quite a bit depends on pilot skill. Second, a lot depends on their ability to coordinate with other units, right? There are parts of the front where it's well coordinated and parts on the front where it's less so. It's a lot easier to coordinate when conducting offensive operations, when you've planned on it. When you're conducting defensive operations, it can be a toss-up, right? The third part is a fair amount depends on integration of drone employment, your situational awareness of the battlefield, ISR, electronic warfare systems, right? And integration is very important. In some places, things are very well integrated, and others not so much. And, so I'm going to channel Steve Biddle a bit and say that force employment matters a lot towards what you get out of the technology and the performance you're able to achieve. And we should also be clear that as we're talking about this technology and the tactics with which it is employed is fundamentally a moving target, right? That's why we go every couple of months in Ukraine, because there are new innovations, there are new adaptations. The technology is still maturing, and so you often can't tell, like, hey, since it's co-evolving with the counters, which we're about to get to in a minute, you can't always tell. Like, you're often debating with yourself, is this technology just going to mature significantly and become much better than this 6 months from now? Or is it going to be potentially rendered largely ineffective by the counters that rise? You're not always sure which direction it's going to go in and what changes will be required to keep it relevant on the battlefield. And so you often can't tell whether this is as good as it gets, or is it more like aircraft being used in World War I, and this is actually a very early stage of the technology before it's really matured yet. And so I often have those debates with myself. Rob and I go back and forth, and I usually have at least of two opinions in my own head on tech issues. So just to put it out there that there's there are a number of things where you can argue it either way. On the big advantages, what I find with drones is that they are very accessible. But as you rightly put, they are seen more as complementary capability and as an offset. And I think people always look for technology to be a replacement for something else. But drones haven't really replaced any legacy 20th century system on the battlefield, right? That's just the reality. Like, they haven't replaced artillery. They haven't replaced even basic field artillery like mortars. These are still important capabilities that people look to. And to the extent they are an offset, in some areas, we'll talk a few cases where you can see them being very effective, but you have to take that effectiveness with a grain of salt, because you don't know, is that just one particular, is that those contexts where drones are used in that way, can they be representative of a larger front line? And when you see elite units employ drones in a very effective manner, you have to remember that eliteness by definition usually doesn't scale very well, right? So what you see a unit achieve on a 10-kilometer part of the front cannot be scaled to the other 1,000 kilometers that would have to be scaled to for that to really change the way units are fighting. Anyway, with that, let's switch to some of the drawbacks, because a lot of people see the advantages. Oh, one thing I wanted to say while you were talking earlier, and it just came back to me. Two things about drone videos. One, remember, you always see the drone videos of the successful drone hits. They have a big anchoring effect. You never see all the drones that miss or get jammed, so you don't really know what the real effectiveness rates or loss rates are. You rarely ever see the drone videos where 6 drones hit a tank. I mean, there are a few out there, but very few. 6 drones hit a tank and the tank keeps going. Lastly, big reason for that is not information warfare. Biggest reason for that, units that operate drones are all trying to raise money. And so they need to have successful strikes as part of their own branding. They are trying to raise money to get more drones, to get more munitions. And so, there's a clear incentive to show yourself as being successful and as hitting vehicles. And often you'll see drones hitting vehicles on the battlefield that have long been disabled or abandoned. And so just to make it clear to people that whatever you think the effectiveness is, remember, often the metrics I see on the internet of effectiveness, they're not metrics of the effectiveness of drones. They are metrics of posted videos of drones on Telegram, which is a very, very different thing that's being assessed.
There's a post from a Russian Telegram channel who's talking about one of the issues he sees is that the Russian units, they get a certain number of FPVs from the government, and they get a quota, and then they are supposed to demonstrate tangible results with those numbers they get, right? The problem is, instead of those units having incentive to support infantry assaults, which is what they should do because it's what matters, they instead have an incentive to try and hit targets that are tangible, they can show they're achieving results, right? And so, and it's a big issue about when we talk about accuracy rate, because it varies a lot. And one of the reasons it varies so much, if you are an FPV team in a infantry battalion, for example, right? That battalion is doing assault the next day. There may be a critical target you have to destroy, right? Maybe it's like an ATGM position, an AGS-17, right? Whatever it is. That may be a tough position to destroy because EW coverage, because of weather, because of terrain, because of any number of different things. But because it is a critical target, you have to expend as many FPVs to destroy it until you destroy it, right? And in that regard, their accuracy may be lower, and you may have these kind of special operations units who are just there to kill targets opportunity. They can choose what they kill, and they can do it whenever they want to. They can wait until maybe the unit, the other side is attacking when they move beyond most of their EW coverage, and they can only hit targets under perfect conditions, and then they can kind of say, okay, we have an 80% accuracy rate. It's like, well, yes, but it depends what conditions you're operating under, right? And so basically, it all depends very heavily. But as you said, what we see on social media is never representative of the war. They're massive selection bias problems. Both sides, they want to show themselves succeeding, especially when you see a video of a FPV destroying a tank and the tank blows up into a huge fireball. That is the most likely video to see on Twitter, right? Because if it gets posted on Telegram, well, first off, it will definitely make its way to Telegram. It will definitely get taken from Telegram to Twitter. And then once it gets to Twitter, it'll get retweeted a huge number of times. Whereas if it's a video of you hitting a tank and the tank keeps kind of lumbering on, it probably won't get uploaded to Twitter, right? And then if it does, it will not get retweeted very much. I know because I always post them when I see this stuff, and no one really cares, right? So there's massive selection bias issues. What we see is not representative, and it leads to a lot of problems. And one issue in particular, so there's a group of OSINT guys on Twitter called Tochny is their group, and they record the number of FPV strikes. And they have the really good data of every recorded kind of FPV video they see on social media. They try and record like what is targeted and so on, both the Ukrainian side and the Russian side. They keep seeing more Ukrainian strikes than Russian side strikes. The issue, though, is that every time we've been there in November and it's last time, every UAV unit we have on the Ukrainian side said Russia has a quantitative advantage in FPVs, right? So UAV units say this, the infantry units say this, battalion, brigade commanders, UAV company commanders,
brigades that count. I would say brigades that have very good metrics and who count every single drone hit and who count the drones that they detect that don't hit. What they also say, Ukrainians are pretty meticulous about collecting data. Actually, some of them are pretty relentless about it. It's fairly impressive. And they collect data and stats for months upon months of their time in a particular part of the front or as part of a campaign. And so it does get frustrating sometimes when you have a good sense of the data because people have been collecting it and the data consistently shows one thing on the front line. But then maybe when it comes to, the number of videos that get posted, there's more videos on the other side. Anyway, I just wanted to interject because I also get frustrated by this. So I wish you get back to your point, Rob. But it's important to tease out these differences in data and how two things are important. First, how you measure, and second, what you choose to measure.
And so again, the data those guys they get is great. They do a very good job. It helps us have a better understanding of how FPVs are being used. I'm just saying that it doesn't give you a complete story. And you always have to keep in mind that, the known knowns and unknown unknowns. And there are things that we don't see And it's important to keep that in mind. We go to the Ukraine, we talk to units there. We always find information that contradicts what you might see on social media because you don't get a very good kind of picture of everything. So, all right, we talk about FPV limitations. The first one to talk about, and we mentioned a little bit, is about kind of signals and how they operate. So FPVs operate on a line of sight. So it's a line of sight connection between the operator, the antenna from the operator, and the FPV itself, or if you use a retrans UAV. And basically, the problem if you don't use a retrans UAV is that terrain creates a problem where, and you've probably seen this if you see FPV videos, as they start their terminal guidance, you'll probably have a decent video feed. And then as they start coming back down to earth, right, when they run into line of sight problems to the operator, the footage will actually start to blur. And sometimes you lose, the footage altogether, right? It's not always EW. It could just be line of sight issues. So that's one problem by itself. Retransmitter UAVs help. But even, a lot of this depends on terrain, right? So you said before, in forest terrain, the trees can block out signals, and that makes it more difficult to hit targets under, a canopy of trees. It makes it more difficult if you're operating around hills, all things like that. All these things can affect them and make it more difficult, and it means that terrain matters a lot, right? And so, over the summer in our rehab area, the Russian units, FPV units operating down there had a benefit, and they had high grounds, and so they could operate more effectively in targeting Ukrainian units during the counteroffensive based on terrain, right? And basically, terrain played a role in why FPVs are quite effective there, but maybe less effective in other places. So that's part of it. The signals themselves, right, these are mostly analog signals. The problem is these signals will interfere with one another, right, especially if you have multiple FPVs in close proximity. And what that means is you can't really scale this up that much because, typically what Ukraine will do is if you have multiple FPV teams supporting assault, they will deconflict by sequencing. So one team will hit a target at a time, and once that FPV hits, the next team will launch its FPV, so you won't have multiple FPVs at the same time. If you have too many together, what happens is the video feeds start to blur together, and maybe you'll take over the video feed of the FPV next to you, or vice versa. That also happens all the time. That if Russian FPVs are operating where you're operating, right, you might get the Russian feed, and they might get your feed instead, and so neither one of you can actually hit the target properly, and so it creates a variety of issues. But basically, the signals and because they're unencrypted, it becomes a problem of operating too many FPVs in one area at the same time. It means you can't scale that in large numbers in a kind of small confined space, right? And so especially when we talk about mortars or artillery, right, you can obviously fire a lot of artillery and mortars in a small confined space. They're not affected by the same limitations. FPVs are for the time being. Maybe if they start encrypting signals, they improve the signals, that would change. But for the time being, that's one of the big issues. Another issue is weather. So weather, again, doesn't really affect artillery or mortars that much. However, winds is a big problem for FPVs. If it's overcast, FPVs, again, they rely on the camera on the FPV going back to the operator and be able to see a target. And so it's very overcast. They often can't see a target. And what you see in many cases is maybe the Russians or one side, they'll wait until the weather's very overcast, and they'll have success advancing because FPVs will not be effective for several days. That was one, during the Battle of Avdiivka, that was reportedly one of the issues. There's a couple of days of overcast weather. Russia was able to kind of advance when FPVs were not operational or not that effective. Also, most FPVs, most of them don't have night vision optics. They can't operate effectively at night. They are now scaling up thermal optics more often, although that adds cost to it as well. And so that affects kind of when FPVs are operated. It also affects kind of when units do their assaults. So when we were there in November, a lot of the Ukrainians that were still doing assaults in Arihiv were doing them first thing in the morning before FPVs were kind of effective, but still not at nighttime. But basically, once the vehicles drop off assault units, they didn't leave the day because they were denied the rest of the day and they couldn't operate. So it would affect kind of the timing and when they would operate. Like we said before, batteries are a big issue. So the range is mostly limited by battery power. And batteries, you lose much of your battery power as you ascend. And so one development both are trying to do is create motherboard UAVs that can drop FPVs, which one will improve the targeting timing, so it takes less time to actual launch for hitting a target. It also removes some of the battery issues with FPVs, could extend their range. But particularly cold weather, if the battery is cold, the range is less because they can operate better when it's warmer weather. So that's another effect on how effective FPVs are. Of course, all the different components, because they're non-standardized, It creates a lot of issues for piloting because piloting is quite difficult. It takes a lot of time. Many people don't have the aptitude to be an FPV pilot. They have issues with like motion sickness and other things. So it really depends on how experienced your pilots are. But also because the munitions are not standardized, right? Different munitions have different aerodynamics. Different FPVs have different aerodynamics. That affects how effective a pilot can be. That's one of the reasons we were talking before about the accuracy rating being so kind of all over the place, right? And again, we've heard units talk about 10 to 50% accuracy. We've heard 70, 80%, heard 58%, multiple guys saw 40%. Just it's all over the place. I would say I said overall, right? If we had to aggregate this, I would say it's under 50% of the time they hit targets, but it really depends on range, terrain, weather, EW. Is it a moving target? Is it a stationary target? Right? All the skill of the pilot. All these kind of things come into to determining how accurate they're going to be. But keep in mind too, even though the accuracy it's not 100%, and we shouldn't treat this as a kind of one-for-one munition that's going to kill a target every time. But also, right, the munitions they use, because their weight limitations, you're not using ideal munitions in most cases. So the anti-armor munitions they use are RPG munitions, but they can't, right, as of now, I don't think we've seen, maybe we've seen one or two tandem RPG munitions. For the most part, we haven't seen tandem RPG rounds. That means that on tanks, right, explosive reactive armor, designed to defeat RPGs. Well, if you're using RPG munitions, they can still be defeated that way. And so FPVs to kill a tank, they typically have to hit a very specific place in the back of it. The accuracy really matters, and there are a lot of very cheap countermeasures that make it difficult, right? So explosive reactive armor is effective. Creating these roof screens or roof cages around tanks can be effective. Small EW jammers on vehicles, which are becoming much more common, right? A lot of these are pretty cheap, and they can basically blank out the video feed for the last 30, 40 meters of an FPV's flight, right? And on a moving target, that's enough to kind of defeat them. Smoke is important. That can be used again to make it to reduce accuracy. So there are all sorts of things that come into this, but because munitions aren't standardized, because and we compare it to ATGMs, the munition on ATGM is also often like 8, maybe 10 pounds. Well, FPVs, it's much less than that. It's like half of that. And so again, we're talking about their effectiveness against tanks is often, quite less. And there's the 93rd Mechanized Brigade, Ukraine Brigade, they actually put out data on their, kind of monthly FPV success. And they mentioned for 2 or 3 months, they hit like 17 tanks and none of which were destroyed. And we've seen other figures that kind of indicate very similar things, that basically with tank hits, even if you hit tanks, maybe you damage them, and that could be important by itself, right? If you knock out optics, if you immobilize it, but in many cases, you're not going to create a catastrophic kill on a tank. And of course, many times you do have a catastrophic kill on a tank. It's already been immobilized by ATGMs, by artillery, by mines, right? And so we talk about the cost dynamics. Well, if the FPV is killing a already immobilized tank, you have to factor in the cost of those existing systems to talk about the actual FPV effectiveness. But when we talk about FPV effectiveness in terms of not just accuracy, but actually killing a target, right, we're talking, probably 25%, 20% of the time, they actually kill many of these targets if we're talking about like a tank or something along those lines. And so it really depends. And also keep in mind, and you mentioned this before, Mike, that the context in which FPVs will be operating in Ukraine is not necessarily a context they'll operate in different conflict. And so it could be quite different.
That's what happened to the Bayraktar. That's exactly what happened to the Bayraktar we saw in the Nagorno-Karabakh War 2020. Everybody said, this thing's the best thing since sliced bread. We got to get it. And it was relevant in the first 2 weeks of the war and maybe in a couple other specific episodes, but you haven't heard much of it over the last 2.5 years.
Exactly. And that's why when we talk about FPVs, like what the role in the future is, I don't know. Or that's the short answer.
Okay, we're going to stop the conversation here. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Russia Contingency. We are going to pick up our discussion on drones with Rob in a second part of this episode.
Thanks again for listening to The Russia Contingency. You've heard me say it before. I'm going to say it once more. If you want to listen to The Russia Contingency whenever it comes out, you just need to join War in the Rocks Platinum by becoming a member at warintherocks.com/membership. Stay safe and stay healthy.